Hey guys, welcome to my YouTube channel, The Vintage Watch Guy. Today we're going to talk about reading a vintage watch. Vintage watch buying, a lot of people feel is a minefield. It's complicated. You can't just walk into a store, hand over some money, expect to get a good watch. You really have to have some education. So I would recommend before you start thinking about buying a vintage watch, that you begin by educating yourself. You can start on the internet. Let's look at sites like Hodinkee, look at instances of good watches. You can go to reputable dealers like Analog Shift and just see what's out there, see what a good watch looks like. Look at as many pictures as you can. Other places you can get information is that you can buy books. There's some specialty books if you're looking to buy a very specialized or expensive watch. There's specialty books that you can buy which have a lot of references that you can compare the watch to. But I would put off buying something like that until you really have a lot of experience with watches. You can also look on places like Instagram, different hashtags for the type of watch you're interested in. eBay, watch forums are a really good resource. They have a lot of expertise. There's some Facebook watch groups now. But I would say the most important thing is just go out there, go to vintage watch shops, go to pawn shops, just get out there in the world and look and touch and feel as many vintage watches as you can. And the more you look at them, the more you touch them and see them in person, the better idea you'll have. You can also try going to watch meetups. There may be some people with vintage interests there as well. And I would say also, the more expensive and desirable the watch, the more potential for fraud. For example, if you have a watch that's worth, say, $1,500, and you want to do some kind of restoration job on it, repaint the dial, change the hands, redo the case, do some laser welding on the case, and repolish it, all that work is expensive. So if you spend $1,000 fixing a $1,500 watch, then where's your profit margin? But if you spend $1,000 fixing up a $20,000 watch, well, that's very different. So the incentive to fix a watch goes up the higher the price. So I would suggest, unless you really have a lot of knowledge and expertise, or you have some friends that you can turn to for guidance, to put off buying very expensive pieces and start with more basic models. The other thing that people often say is that you want to buy the seller, buy it from a reputable source. I would say, yes, that's important. Someone with a reputation to maintain is less likely to sell you, a fraudulent piece. But for vintage watches, I think it's very much buyer beware. So you really need to know what you're doing, and you should be able to, before you buy a vintage watch, in my opinion, you should be able to establish the value of the watch and what you would pay for it, completely independent of what anybody tells you. You really need to be the one who's the expert. And if you have that knowledge, rather than just buying the seller, I think it's just as important or more important to have a seller that has a good return policy if you have concerns about the watch. So even if you buy online, if you buy using PayPal, there's some protections there. When you buy on Chrono24, the money goes into an escrow account, and it's not released until you have a chance to see the watch and inspect it. So I would say, rather than buying the seller, I would say it's more important to make yourself the expert. Another thing I suggest before getting to vintage watches is find a good watchmaker. The vintage watches need a lot of care and attention, and not every watchmaker wants to spend the time or has the passion for working on them. So try to find a good watchmaker and become friends with them if you can, because you'll probably be spending a lot of time together. And if you have a friend that you can ask, or when you're first getting into posting the watch on a watch forum or other online location where you give good photos of the front, the back, the movement if you have a picture, that will give you a lot of guidance as well, and hopefully prevent you from making mistakes in the beginning. So I'd like to introduce you to what I call the WATCH method. It's an acronym for wrist, antiquity, time, case, and how much. And I'm going to go through some of these watches and go through my method. So we'll start with wrist. When I look at a vintage watch, the first thing I look at is, what's my overall impression on the wrist? Is it too big, too small, too thick? Is the dial beautiful? Does it appeal to me? I think it's very important to take the watch out of the case and put it on the wrist. You see this one is a Seiko Bellmatic with a very bold 70s style design, very wide cushion case. It's quite thick. But on the bracelet, it's pretty comfortable on the wrist, which gives a very different impression than this Imperial chronograph. This has a Venus 170 movement in it. You can see it's in there. The chronograph registers are at 12 and 6. And this watch, it's much smaller. It's, I would say, elegant. It has a snail dial. It has the red details. It's a very different watch on the wrist. To me, both these watches are very appealing, but you can see that the styles are very different. And I think when you first assess the watch, the most important thing is to just look at the aesthetics and see if the aesthetics appeal to you. Because if you don't like having it on your wrist, or it feels uncomfortable, or if it's too thick, or it's too small, or too light, if it feels uncomfortable to you, then you're not going to wear it. So the overall impression is W for wrist. The second part of it, antiquity, is establishing approximate age. Once you have some experience, you can just sort of look at a watch. When you see these kind of bold colors, say it's a Seiko, the Bellmatic, was a 70s watch, the case-shaped cushion. These are all style emblems of the 70s. Whereas this one, the movement helps give it away too. The movement was made from 1942 to 1960, so it falls in that range. The size, the small size, drilled lugs, the snail dial especially, the style of the dial, the style of the pushers and the crown, all gives this away as probably being a 40s piece. It's also important because some pieces are quote unquote modern vintage. This is a Seagull 1963 watch. Has vintage look, 2 registers, and but there's several things that give it away as being a modern watch. One, vintage chronographs from this era, from the 60s, are not so thick. Modern movements are generally thicker. It has a see-through case back that's not typical of the 60s. If you look at the dial, the printing, the style is just very different from what they kind of chronographs approved in the 60s. And it doesn't have that kind of patina. Also, the crystal is a sapphire crystal. It's not acrylic. You don't have that acrylic bump. And you don't see the kind of scratches you see with the wear from a watch that's from the 60s. If you know much about watches, you'll immediately identify this as a Seagull 1963. But if you don't have any experience, it's easy to be fooled by these vintage reissues. And if you had a 1960s 2-register chronograph, it could be worth a good bit of money. But these you can buy online, fairly inexpensively, surprisingly inexpensively, I would say. Whereas this watch is interesting to date. This is a Breitling Premier, and vintage Breitlings are good in that they have a serial number, and it's right on the back. It's not inside the case back. You don't have to open the watch to see it. So you can actually look, here, this is the reference number 788, and the number above it is the serial number. And you can actually compare this against an online database and find the exact year the watch was made. This one's made in 1945. Of course, things like that can be faked, but you can see that the stamping on there is very crisp and clear. It's very typical for a Breitling chronograph from the 40s. Other things you can do to independently date the watch, you can take a look at the face. If you look closely at there, the numerals are actually in radium. If I had a black light, I could show you a little bit better, but it has a typical appearance of radium. Tritium tends to age into more of like a creamy yellow hue. Or if the tritium gets wet, it turns into kind of like a moldy color. Radium tends to age into more like a heterogeneous color with some dark and light spots in it. You can see both the hands and the numerals have a little bit of radium on them. Radium was used, starting with trench watches in the 20s. As time went on and they realized the dangers of radiation exposure, they used less and less of it. They started switching to tritium in the 50s. So when you look at the amount of radium on there, which is relatively little, it's not the kind of thickly applied radium you see on older watches. You can see that this is towards the end of the radium area, so 1945 fits very well. See also the hands are beautifully blued. The 3-register chronograph is very typical of that time period as well. It's a Venus movement in these typically, which you can tell by the alignment of the pushers and the crown. See the drilled lugs. So when you look at all the pieces of this together, starting with the serial number and the reference number, and looking at the luminous, the tachymeter along the edge, the case, it all fits together as being a 1940s chronograph. The next part of this is time, what I call time, which is, does a watch work? Does it tick? What does the movement look like? What does it sound like? Do the complications work? This is also an important feature because it's related to what the overhaul expense will be, and if the watch can even be fixed or overhauled. Now, you also want to find out, does the seller give any guarantee? Is the watch sold in so-called as-is condition? If it is, you should factor in the cost of a service. Now, the watch may tick, it may work, but it doesn't mean that the watch's movement is in good condition. This particular watch I purchased, and the watch was ticking, it was working, the pushers were working, but I found out the watch was not keeping good time. Every hour is off by 5 minutes. And what made this more complicated is that, first of all, it has a complication. So it's a triple calendar moon phase with a pointer date. And it's also made by a company called Marvin, which was a Swiss company that doesn't really exist in a modern form. They sell some Marvin branded watches, I think, or they were at some point, but the watch doesn't have a continuous history. There's not a parts supply. And when my watchmaker went in to fix it, the inside of the watch had some pieces that were not original, weren't fitted to the watch, and it was very, very difficult to find a replacement. He spent several months asking different vintage part suppliers if they had the parts he needed, and ultimately he had to make the parts on a lathe. So I think he had this watch for definitely more than 6 months, maybe 8 months or 9 months, in order to get it back. So, in addition to the cost, one of the problems with buying vintage wristwatches is the movement, and assessing the movement can be difficult. Not every seller will be able to remove the case back for you. Some of them, when you look at them trying to remove the case back, you don't want them to remove the case back because it's scary it looks like they might scratch the watch or dent the watch. Unlike pocket watches, which have case backs generally that are meant to be removed and are relatively easy to remove, watches, made to be dust proof and so on, The case backs tend to be a little bit hard to remove, and getting a good look at the movement isn't always easy. If if the watch, if it's a good price, if the watch is not very expensive, and the watch is ticking, sometimes I may just buy the watch and factor in the cost of a service into the price. Um, if the watch is something that has a lot of complications or is complicated, I would definitely consider, what is the return policy of the seller before committing to a complicated piece or a piece from a brand that doesn't have parts readily available. That's in very stark contrast to, for example, vintage Omega, where the parts are much easier to find. The movements were typically standardized. A lot of them were sold so that you can generally get the parts pretty easily, and it's the price of the parts is going up, but at least they're available. With the Marvin, it took a while, and that was pretty challenging. Another part of it is the case. So there's a few different things you want to look at when you're looking at the case. One is the case over polished? This case actually is not over polished. It's in actually pretty good condition. You can tell because in terms of the polishing, you can see that there's still this satin finish on the edges. And the edges of it are quite sharp. If you feel it, touch it, you can see it there. There's a good contrast at the edges. You can see the bevels here on the lugs. So this case is definitely not over polished. However, this case has a different problem, which is that this is not a solid case. This is a chrome-plated case over base metal. Base metal is usually some form of brass. So this one actually is interesting because you can see on the case there's some corrosion. You can see a little bit of pitting. That kind of pitting is considered pretty undesirable. Some people won't buy a watch that has this kind of pitting. It certainly can compromise the waterproofness of the watch. I mean, you could replate or rechrome a watch, but I've never tried to do that before. I think that would destroy the originality. You can also see the brass exposure worn through on the crown as well. Here, the so-called brassing of the crown. A little bit on the pushers. But despite the case condition, I still bought this watch. Actually, this is the first vintage watch that I bought because I love the telemeter, tachymeter, red and blue on the dial, and the 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock orientation of the subdials, the hands, the numerals. Aside from the case, it's a very beautiful watch. And, I'm careful with it. I don't take this one out in the rain, and I get a lot of satisfaction with it despite the issues with the case. Whereas the over-polished case, where the edges are all softened, that, I generally get less pleasure from. And some cases have other interesting features. This one, for example, I showed in the last video, this bubble back. You can see that it has an engine turned bezel. If you look at it closely, it's a little hard to see in the light, but you can actually see the lines in it, as well as the dots. And you can see the edges here, as well as the gold mark. This has these old bubble backs, some of them have very beautiful cases. This is Omega Memomatic. This case is actually quite rare. This is a B case that was only produced for a short time in the 70s, along with the blue dial, the blue Seamaster Memomatic dial, which is also less common. And this case is notable because it has the original sunburst finishing along the front of it. This kind of sunburst gets scratched very easily, so you don't see it that intact that frequently. And then you can see the bevels are very beautiful as well. See that there's a sort of satinized finish on the edges, and there's a black polish along this edge. So you can see the case of this one is in really beautiful condition. And this is another watch, a Croton, that's got a sunburst finish as well. This sunburst finish has got a couple of scratches on it, but you still see it's a similar idea. This isn't really like a true black polish here, but because this watch was a much less expensive watch, you can see it has a sunburst finish on the front, which is very beautiful. And so when you go through everything, you look at everything, you sort of, I think the last step is H, which is how much is the price fair? How do you determine if the price is fair? Well, first of all, to determine the price, you got to do all your steps. So the wrist impression, is what watch are you looking at? What do you have on your wrist? How old is it? Is the movement working? Is the movement clean? If it's not clean, then what does the movement feel like when you wind it? When you wind the watch, it should feel crisp, and the second hands should start ticking relatively soon after 2 or 3 winds. If it's been sitting a while, you may need to give it a shake like this to get the second hand to start moving, but it should start moving relatively quickly, smoothly. If it has a chronograph, the chronograph should work. Let me give this a few more winds before we test out this chronograph. Does the chronograph work? Yes. I usually will let it go for a minute at least to see if the minute subdial is ticking forward. Does it reset to 0? Is it crisp? Does it feel good? If it has a winding rotor, when you spin it, does it wind? Does the watch start working right away? I would say that part, time, the mechanism, that's probably the hardest part to really assess. And looking at movements, even if you have the picture, well, the picture you can tell, is it rusty? Is it really bad? But it does take a lot of expertise to see if all the pieces in there are correct. So that's probably the toughest part, and that's where a good watchmaker comes into play. And then you look at the case. Is the case really, really over-polished, or does it have the original finish? Is it sharp? Are the edges sharp? Does it have the beveling? So once you have all this, especially knowing what the watch is, you can sort of get an idea about the price. Trying to figure out the price for a watch is a little bit hard. Ultimately, it's the price of the watch is what someone is willing to pay. It depends also on the market, what other people are willing to pay. I usually start by looking on eBay at the sold listings. That's a pretty good idea. If you just look at what people are asking on eBay, it doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean they're getting that. If they ask for 10,000, they may be getting 2. It doesn't mean anything. But if you filter it by sold listings, sold and completed, and you can sort them high to low or low to high, you get an idea. This watch, $5,000 gets you this kind of condition. $4,000 gets you this kind of condition. $3,000, okay, you're getting some serious issues here. $2,000, the watch isn't even running. It's like that. So you can sort of, if you sort it by price, and get an idea of, the top examples, in terms of condition, to sort of the fixer-upper watches, or other ones with serious condition issues, redials, non-running watches, which may be a bargain. It may be good in some ways, especially if the watch is not running. You don't know why, but you can open up and it could be a disaster. So it's that risk is what takes some of the price off. Other good place to look, Watch Recon. Search the watch, which is a search tool for the watch forums. The prices on there, sometimes they can be high, just like any market. But if you look at a lot of the watches, you start to get an idea, approximately what does it go for. There's other places you can look online. Etsy has a handful of watches. Chrono24 is a really good resource. Chrono24, there's a lot of watch dealers on there, so you can expect Depending on the watch, there may be some kind of discount available, but you can at least get a rough idea of what people are selling for. And you can also sort by price. If you want to see what the top examples go for, I would say look on Instagram, send a direct message to the person with the most number of clicks, and see what what they're asking. Those can be pretty high, but those are talking about the best condition there. So anyway, that's my guide to vintage watches, reading a vintage watch, the watch method, to help you have at least a framework in which to start to assess these watches. Again, most important thing is to be an educated buyer, to educate yourself, to be knowledgeable about watches, and go out there and buy. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you in the next one.